They tore a trench through my cattle ranch, 87 acres, gutted overnight, and billed me for the damage. While watching my $34,000 in lost calves and hay production disappear, I didn't just get mad. I got strategic. You should have seen their faces at their grand fountain showcase. When I showed up at the main valve, phone recording Israel's precious water features sputtered into pathetic mud puddles. Turns out, century-old water rights beat laminated HOA bylaws any day of the week. Who knew? Stick around to see how one dusty property deed and 3 phone calls to the county office transformed their sprinkler tyranny into the sweetest justice served cold. By the way, that conservation easement trick in Part 7, completely legal in 43 states. You're welcome. I'm Jackson Miller, 3rd-generation cattle rancher, running what my grandfather started back in 1947. Nothing fancy. 87 acres of decent grazing with Cottonwood Creek cutting through the back 40. Enough for a modest herd and good hay production. 2 years ago, cancer took Sarah, my wife of 20 years, leaving me raising our 16-year-old daughter, Emma, alone. Every evening, I'd sit on our front porch swing, listening to its familiar creak while watching the sunset paint our western pasture gold and purple. Sarah and I had spent countless evenings on that swing, planning our future and Emma's inheritance. Those moments on the swing weren't just a ritual, they were my lifeline through grief. Our ranch sits on what used to be all farmland until developers discovered our charming rural aesthetic. Now we border Sunrise Estates, one of those cookie-cutter luxury developments with names celebrating the nature they paved over. Our county had been suffering through its 2nd year of drought, with water restrictions hitting farmers particularly hard. Meanwhile, Sunrise Estates kept their medians emerald green and their decorative fountains flowing like they'd never heard the word conservation. Their HOA president, Victoria Harrington, moved from California 5 years ago after retiring from corporate law. She ran that neighborhood like a military operation, with an evangelical zeal for uniform aesthetics and rising property values. I first met her at a county meeting where she referred to our farms as visually disruptive agricultural clutter. She wore tailored pantsuits and carried herself with the rigid posture of someone who'd never had to pull a calf at 3 a.m. Her perfume smelled like expensive department stores and condescension. Victoria had transparent ambitions for city council, campaigning on modernizing our region's potential, code for pushing out agricultural operations like mine. What I didn't realize was how far she'd go to build her political portfolio. The stakes appeared one Tuesday morning, thin orange markers dotting a straight line across my south pasture. Following them, I found a work crew unloading equipment at my property line. Their foreman handed me a document showing an approved utility easement for a water pipeline feeding Sunrise Estates' new 3-acre decorative lake and fountain plaza. "This is the first I'm hearing about any easement on my property," I said, scanning paperwork that looked official but made no sense. "Not our problem, sir," the crew chief shrugged, not even bothering to look up. "We're just following the approved plan. Take it up with the county." The next morning, the sound of bulldozer engines roaring to life at dawn sent my cattle into a panic, breaking through the fence line. By the time I got them rounded up, the machines had already carved a 6-foot-wide wound across my land. The county inspector arrived that afternoon, looking genuinely uncomfortable as he reviewed my deed and their documents. "And look, Mr. Miller, I understand your frustration, but their paperwork appears in order. Sometimes these old easements get overlooked during property transfers." "This easement wasn't overlooked. It never existed," I insisted. He just shook his head. "You'll need to take that up with the courts." My regular attorney wasn't optimistic. "They've got Grayson and Phelps representing them, Jackson. That's a corporate firm with 12 attorneys. Fighting this could cost you $40,000 with no guarantee of winning. They've clearly greased some wheels at the county level." When I confronted Victoria at the HOA office, she barely looked up from her desk. "We're prepared to offer $1,800 0 cents for any temporary inconvenience," she said, sliding a document toward me. "That's quite generous, considering these easements are pre-existing." "Pre-existing where? I've got property surveys going back to my grandfather." She smiled thinly. "Perhaps you should review your documentation more carefully." "Progress happens, Mr. Miller. Sunrise Estates represents the future of this community. Agricultural activities are simply becoming incompatible with the region's development. As I left, I heard her secretary whisper, "Another angry farmer. Doesn't he know what century this is?" Despite my protests, construction began in earnest the next day. When I parked my truck to block their equipment access, Victoria called the sheriff. Deputy Reynolds, a man I'd known since high school, arrived, looking uneasy. "Jackson, I can't let you obstruct a permitted project. I've seen their paperwork." "That paperwork is fraudulent, Dave. You know this land has been in my family for generations." He sighed. "Then you need to handle it through proper channels. Until a judge says otherwise, they have authorization." When I started photographing the work crew digging beyond the marked easement boundaries, Victoria filed a harassment complaint. 3 days later, their trenching machines severed my irrigation line to the hay field, flooding 5 acres of pasture. The foreman claimed it wasn't on their survey. That evening, Emma found me at the kitchen table, surrounded by property maps and old deeds. "Dad, have you checked the county's online records? They digitized everything last year for that historic preservation grant." Smart kid. While I'd been fighting bulldozers, my tech-savvy daughter went digital. By midnight, we discovered something crucial. The easement paperwork Victoria filed used property boundaries from 1973, before my grandfather purchased the adjoining 20 acres from the Hargrove estate. The supposed utility corridor in their documents didn't match current legal property line. "Dad, look at this," Emma pointed to her screen. "My civics teacher covered this. Once someone uses land continuously for a certain period, usually 10, 20 years, they can claim a right to keep using it. But there's no way they can claim historical use of land that was never accessed." With this information, I filed an emergency injunction first thing the next morning. By afternoon, I'd rallied 6 neighboring ranchers to witness and document the property line discrepancies and water damage. My high school classmate, Michael Landry, now reporting for the county newspaper, published a small but pointed article questioning the permit process and unusual speed of approval for the Sunrise Estates water project. That evening, I installed trail cameras at strategic points along the construction path, carefully positioned on my side of the property line. 2 days later, Judge Harmon granted a partial stay of construction, but allowed work to continue on portions already begun, which conveniently included the most critical sections, through my land. I later learned Victoria had played golf the previous weekend with County Commissioner Wilson, after which the project had received expedited review status. Within hours of the ruling, I received a cease and desist letter from Grayson and Phelps regarding defamatory statements made to local media with malicious intent to damage Sunrise Estates' reputation. From my front porch, I watched the trenching machine cutting across my cattle pasture like a mechanical snake, leaving churned earth and severed roots in its wake. The hollow feeling in my stomach wasn't just anger anymore. It was the realization that I was fighting a system designed to favor developers over agricultural landowners who couldn't afford endless legal battles. But Emma's discovery had given me something powerful, evidence of procedural violations. If I couldn't stop them with brute force, I'd need to find their technical vulnerabilities. And I knew just who to call. Frank Jennings had been my father's attorney before retiring 5 years ago. His specialty? Water rights disputes. Within an hour of my call, he was sitting at my kitchen table reviewing Emma's findings. "They've made a critical mistake," he said, tapping a weathered finger on the county map. "Have you checked where their pipeline originates? This isn't city water they're tapping." We drove up to the construction staging area and followed the pipeline path backward, hiking into the foothills watershed. The source wasn't municipal infrastructure as I'd assumed. It was Campbell Spring, a natural artesian well that had fed Cottonwood Creek for generations. "Whoever owns the water owns the power," Frank explained simply as we photographed the connection point. "In plain English, whoever got to the water first gets first dibs." Even centuries later. This discovery gave me hope, but Victoria was moving with impressive speed. Their pipeline was completed in just 3 weeks, a project that should have taken months, given permitting requirements. By early May, Sunrise Estates was hosting a grand opening ceremony for their Sunrise Lake and Fountain Plaza, promoted as the centerpiece of their next-generation luxury community living. Meanwhile, homeowners whose properties bordered my ranch began receiving citations for unsightly views if farm equipment was visible from their back windows. When I went to the county planning office to discuss road access improvements, I discovered an application had been filed to review my property's agricultural zoning status as a non-conforming use given surrounding development patterns. The stress was spreading beyond just me. Emma came home from school one day, slammed her bedroom door, and wouldn't come out for dinner. When I finally coaxed her out, her eyes were red from crying. "They made a whole social page about me, Dad," she whispered, showing me her phone. The children of HOA board members had created Farmer Miller's backward daughter, photoshopping Emma's face onto various unflattering images. "I don't want to go back tomorrow." I held her while she cried, feeling a rage I hadn't experienced since Sarah's diagnosis. These are the same people who let their fountains run during a drought while telling farmers to cut back, I told her. That says everything about their character. 2 days later, Emma refused to attend her debate club competition, something she'd been preparing for all semester. That night, I found her looking through old photo albums of Sarah. "Mom would have known what to do," she said quietly. "She never let anyone push us around." When I applied for my seasonal operating loan, something the bank had approved automatically for 15 years, the loan officer suddenly had concerns about collateral valuation given pending legal issues affecting property use. 3 of my best heifers fell ill after drinking from the creek downstream from the construction site, with the vet finding traces of construction sealant in their systems. I filed an environmental impact complaint with the State Water Board, requesting emergency testing of the watershed. While gathering documentation, Emma discovered something interesting. Victoria Harrington wasn't just HOA president, she personally owned Sunrise Landscaping Services, the company with the exclusive maintenance contract for all HOA properties. Public records showed the company had received over $780,000, 0 cents in contracts over the past 2 years. I meticulously documented this conflict of interest, along with photographs of permit irregularities and contaminated water samples. When construction debris washed onto my property after a brief thunderstorm, I had it tested by an independent lab. Anyone who touches natural water sources has to file environmental impact papers with both state and federal agencies. It's not optional. I requested copies of these mandatory filings through a Freedom of Information request. The response: no such documents exist in our records. The pipeline may have been complete, but Victoria's paper trail was leading me to bigger vulnerabilities than I'd first imagined. The question was whether I could leverage them before my ranch was permanently damaged. Victoria's tactics shifted from bureaucratic to personal. Whispers began circulating that I was unstoppable since his wife's death and becoming dangerously obsessed with fighting the HOA. At their monthly meeting, Sunrise Estates voted to increase their legal defense fund, raising member dues by 15% to prepare for ongoing litigation related to I noticed the creek's flow diminishing as their landscaping company began pumping excessive water to maintain their new 3-acre lake during peak drought conditions. Their marketing brochures now featured the lake prominently, with new homes surrounding it priced $150,000, 0 cents higher than identical models elsewhere in the development. One evening, while going through Sarah's old desk, something I'd been avoiding, I found her journal. The last entry, dated 3 weeks before she died, read, "Made Jackson promise again to keep the ranch for Emma. This land isn't just soil and grass, it's our family's heart." Those words hit me harder than any bulldozer. The smell of barbecue smoke drifting across my property line that weekend brought an unexpected visitor. Walter Simmons, a stooped man in his 70s, introduced himself as a Sunrise Estates resident. Looking nervously over his shoulder, he explained he was a retired federal judge who'd purchased a retirement home in the community. "What they're doing isn't right," he said quietly, handing me a manila envelope. "I've been attending board meetings. These are internal memos about the pipeline project. They knew the permits weren't proper." The documents revealed something stunning. Board minutes explicitly acknowledging potential legal complications regarding property access, but approving the project anyway because regulatory penalties would be less expensive than proper easement acquisition. Another memo outlined Victoria's plan to use the lake project as her centerpiece achievement when announcing her candidacy for county commissioner. Meanwhile, Emma's high school history project on local water usage had taken her to the county archives. She came home excited, dusty folders under her arm. "Dad, look what I found in the original land grant section. Maps from the 1880s showing water rights assignments." She spread yellow documents across the table. "Campbell Spring is specifically mentioned here as water source 17, with rights assigned to the original Miller homestead in 1887. I reached out to Frank again, who explained in simple terms, someone can own land without owning the water under it, and vice versa. It's like owning the field, but not the gold underneath. With this information, I requested a search of chain of title records for Campbell Spring. While we waited for results, I began quiet inquiries about the current ownership of the 20-year parcel containing the spring. County records showed it belonged to Elmer Campbell, age 87, grandson of the original homesteader. When I finally visited the county records room to examine the original documents, the musty smell of ancient deed books hit me like opening a time capsule filled with forgotten promises. Each carefully handwritten entry represented someone's dream of building a future on this land. My great-grandfather's signature, faded but still legible, marked his understanding that water would always be the lifeblood of this valley. That evening, looking through more of Sarah's things, I found a small box containing her grandmother's wedding ring and a note. "For Emma, when she's ready. Some traditions are worth preserving." I realized then that this fight wasn't just about property rights. It was about promises kept across generations. Victoria might have modern lawyers and political connections, but I had something much older and possibly more powerful on my side. Frank called me at dawn, his voice more animated than I'd heard in years. "Jackson, you need to see this. I've confirmed the water rights chain of title. Your great-grandfather's original water rights to Campbell Spring were never transferred, despite multiple property subdivisions. The spring parcel was sold several times, but the water rights were specifically reserved in each deed until 1943, when your grandfather purchased them separately." "So what does that mean exactly?" I asked. "It means your family still owns rights to the water from Campbell Spring, the original amount from 1887. Sunrise Estates is currently diverting about 4 times that amount for their lake and fountains without any legal right to a single drop." I sat down hard at the kitchen table. "If we own the water rights, why haven't we been enforcing them?" "Respect, because the creek always had enough flow that downstream users weren't affected, but more importantly, Elmer Campbell, who owns the physical land containing the spring, apparently has no idea the HOA tapped his spring. The pipeline permit application lists municipal water infrastructure as the source, which is blatantly false." I immediately drove out to Campbell's small farm north of town. The elderly man greeted me from his porch, spry despite his years. When I explained the situation, his weathered face hardened. "They came by about 2 years ago offering to buy this parcel. When I refused, they tried to convince me I was sitting on some environmental contamination liability. I told them to pound sand." He shook his head. "Never mentioned a word about the spring. I'd have noticed a construction crew if they'd come through my main property, so they must have accessed it through the county fire road easement." We hiked up to the spring together, finding sophisticated pumping equipment installed in a camouflaged shed with SES, Sunrise Estate Services, stamped on the components. Campbell was livid. "This is straight-up theft," he said. "I never authorized this." Back at my kitchen table, Frank, Emma, and I considered our options. A legal battle would be lengthy and expensive, with no guarantee the court would order immediate cessation of water use during proceedings. "What if we pursued a different strategy?" Emma suggested. "Mr. Campbell seemed pretty upset about the HOA trespassing on his land. He'd mentioned he's been thinking of selling that upper parcel since his arthritis makes it hard to maintain," I said. "He can't run cattle up there anymore." Frank's eyes lit up. "If you purchased that parcel, you'd control physical access to the spring, in addition to already owning the water rights." The idea crystallized instantly. Fighting Victoria through conventional channels meant playing her game on her turf. But this approach would change the playing field entirely. That night, I found Emma in Sarah's old garden, tending the roses her mother had planted. "Do you think this is what Mom would want?" I asked her, explaining the plan to purchase Campbell's spring property. Mom always said, "Don't get mad, get even," Emma replied, a small smile forming. But she also said to fight smart, not hard. She looked up at me. These people flooded our pastures, made me a laughingstock at school, and tried to rezone our home. Yeah, I think Mom would approve. The financial challenge was substantial. Campbell's 20-acre parcel would require leveraging my ranch as collateral, stretching my finances to the breaking point during an already difficult year. But the alternative was watching Victoria drain my water sources while systematically undermining my property rights. I met with Campbell the next day, explaining my plan frankly. The old rancher nodded thoughtfully before offering terms that were firm but fair. Market value for the land, plus a written agreement guaranteeing him lifetime water rights for his remaining property. His only other condition was a strict non-disclosure agreement about the sale until closing. While I arranged financing, Victoria launched her campaign for county commissioner, with campaign posters featuring her standing proudly beside the Sunrise Lake fountain. The HOA increased water usage for their decorative features, despite worsening drought conditions, running sprinklers even during rainstorms. From my kitchen window, I could hear the constant mechanical hum of pumps, drawing water from the spring, like a thief working overtime. But unlike the bulldozers, this was a sound that would soon fall silent. Everything needs to be legally bulletproof, I told Frank as we assembled our team. Victoria's got resources and connections. We can't leave any loopholes. Frank had already tapped his former colleague, Patricia Morales, who specialized in water rights law. Emma's digital skills proved invaluable as she created detailed maps of the water system using GIS data from the county assessor's office. All suffering from reduced creek flow since the pipeline installation, agreed to provide documentation of damages and temporary water access if needed. Most surprisingly, Walter Simmons, the retired judge from Sunrise Estates, continued providing critical insights into the HOA board's planning. "They've gotten arrogant," he reported during our strategy session. "Victoria's convinced the pipeline issue is settled. She's already planning Phase 2, a second lake with waterfront properties." The foundation of our plan centered on water rights law. Patricia filed updated documentation with the state engineer's office to ensure our historical claims were properly recorded in current databases. "We're also creating a conservation easement for the spring property," she explained, spreading documents across my dining table. "This designates the water source as a protected historical agricultural resource. In simple terms, we get tax breaks for protecting the land while making sure nobody can develop it in the future. A win-win that pays us to safeguard our own resources." Financing the purchase stretched my resources to their limit. I took out a second mortgage on the ranch, leveraging everything I owned. "Farm loans often come with much better interest rates than regular commercial loans," my banker explained while processing the paperwork. "Plus, your conservation plan qualifies you for reduced fees." Even with these advantages, the financial strain would be substantial. I needed to ensure we could recover damages for the pipeline's impacts. Emma and I spent evenings calculating lost production value from flooded fields, veterinary bills for affected livestock, and repair costs for damaged irrigation systems. The final figure, $34,876.00 in direct damages, not counting future impacts. My old college friend Thomas Chen, now a water engineer, visited to survey the pipeline and identify critical control points. "They've installed a completely one-directional system," he noted, examining the pumping specifications. "No backflow prevention, no secondary source options. They're completely dependent on this single spring." We documented every potential water diversion violation for regulatory action, installing legal monitoring equipment at various points to measure flow rates and usage patterns. Thomas showed me how to analyze the data. Simple water flow control valves let you limit exactly how much water passes through, just like how much money you can withdraw from an ATM daily, he explained, demonstrating a simple valve system. "You're not cutting off water entirely, just restricting it to what's legally yours." Emma's creativity sparked during one of our planning sessions. "Dad, we should put up signs at the spring," she suggested with a mischievous smile. "How about, 'Welcome to Drought 101, where actions have consequences,' or 'Water Conservation Course, mandatory attendance.'" Her enthusiasm was infectious. For the first time since Sarah's diagnosis, I saw the spark returning to her eyes. This wasn't just about water rights anymore. It was about restoring our family's sense of justice and pride. The plan's legal foundation was critical. Patricia and Frank developed responses for every conceivable HOA countermeasure, from emergency injunctions to eminent domain attempts. We prepared comprehensive documentation packages for media contacts, focusing on drought impacts and environmental violations rather than personal grievances. We also identified potential allies on the county commission who'd been sidelined by Victoria's political maneuvering. Commissioner Ramirez, whose agricultural district had been particularly hard hit by water restrictions, agreed to meet privately to review our documentation. This crosses several legal lines, he acknowledged, reviewing the evidence of permit irregularities. The commission wasn't given complete information about the water source. My hands traced pipeline routes on maps spread across the kitchen table each night, calloused fingers following blue lines like reading Braille. After weeks of preparation, every detail was in place. As Victoria celebrated her political campaign launch at the very lake draining my watershed, I finalized the purchase agreement with Elmer Campbell. The stage was set for a reckoning that Victoria and her HOA never saw coming. The property acquisition closed without fanfare, just a quiet meeting at the title company with Elmer Campbell, who winked as he handed me the keys to the gate. By afternoon, I had filed the updated water rights registry with the state engineer's office and submitted the conservation easement documentation with the county. Within 48 hours, I had replaced the HOA's unmarked access gate with a proper locked entrance displaying private property and protected watershed signs. Thomas installed flow monitoring equipment to document exactly how much water the HOA was diverting, nearly 4 times the historical amount my family was entitled to under prior appropriation rights. Emma's creativity flourished as she designed additional signage. My favorite read Drought Management Training Center. Today's lesson, Consequences, with a professionally printed logo showing a cartoon water drop with a graduation cap. We placed it directly in view of the security cameras. It took precisely 3 days for Victoria to notice something was wrong. The lake level had dropped 6 inches, and residents were reporting reduced water pressure in the decorative fountains. Sunrise Landscaping dispatched a maintenance crew to investigate, only to find new ownership signs and monitoring equipment at the spring. Their confusion was evident in the security camera footage as they called supervisors, gesturing at the locked gate and new signage. By evening, an urgent email from Grayson and Phelps arrived, demanding immediate restoration of unauthorized modifications to Sunrise Estates' utility infrastructure. I didn't respond. Instead, Patricia's firm sent a formal letter the following morning, outlining our documented water rights claims and requesting a comprehensive audit of water usage permissions. The letter included notice of our intent to enforce historical water allocations with a 30-day grace period for compliance discussions. Victoria called an emergency HOA board meeting that same evening. Walter attended and later reported she'd been apoplectic, declaring the situation obvious vandalism and promising swift legal action. What she didn't tell the residents was that their attorney had already warned her about the precarious legal position they were in. Emma and I decided to visit Sunrise Estates the next day to observe the effects firsthand. We parked at the public access point near their community center, watching sprinklers sputter and the once magnificent fountain produce a sad trickle. Several residents stood around the lake's edge, where a ring of mud was already becoming visible. "Maybe we should live stream this," Emma suggested with a grin, holding up her phone. "I could call it, When Karma Hits Your Lake Just Right." "Let's not push it," I cautioned, though I couldn't help smiling. It was the first time I'd seen my daughter genuinely laugh in months. 3 days later, Victoria attempted a different approach. According to my county contact, she invited the water inspector to an appreciation lunch where she suggested a generous consulting fee if he would declare an emergency infrastructure situation requiring immediate restoration of full water flow. To his credit, he declined and reported the conversation to his supervisor. As tensions escalated, so did Victoria's tactics. When Emma visited Sunrise Lake to photograph water levels for our documentation, HOA security followed her car off the property, taking pictures of her license plate. That night, we received the first of several anonymous phone calls. Just silence, then a hang-up. I installed additional security cameras around our property and made sure Emma was never alone when leaving the house. When two of her classmates, children of reasonable Sunrise Estates residents, came over to work on a school project, they brought surprising news. Many homeowners were furious about the emergency assessment and questioning Victoria's leadership for the first time. I stood at my kitchen window one evening, watching HOA sprinklers still running during a rare rainfall, water arcing needlessly through the air while my own cattle drank from muddy puddles. The contrast crystallized everything wrong with their approach to the resources we all depended on. The next morning, I implemented the next phase of our plan. Using the monitoring data Thomas had collected, I adjusted the flow restrictors to allow exactly the amount specified in our historical water rights. For an agricultural operation, this was adequate. For a massive decorative lake and multiple fountains during drought conditions, it was a fraction of what they'd been consuming. Within hours, Victoria mobilized her forces. Letters threatening legal action were delivered to residents bordering my property, claiming I was sabotaging community infrastructure. The HOA attorney filed an emergency petition with the water court, which was quickly denied when Patricia submitted our comprehensive documentation of registered water rights. Victoria's frustration became increasingly evident. When Commissioner Wilson, her usual ally, suggested a negotiated solution might be necessary, she ended their meeting by slamming her car door so hard it echoed across the parking lot. Security cameras at the spring property captured her car slowly driving by 3 times in one afternoon, but she never approached the gate. Emma made a simple sign for our front yard: "Water is for survival, not decoration," with drought statistics for the county. Several passing cars honked in support. That weekend, 3 Sunrise Estates residents stopped by to ask questions, genuinely concerned about what was happening to their water supply. I explained the situation calmly, showing them the documentation of historical water rights. "Victoria never mentioned any of this at the meetings," one woman said, visibly troubled. "She just said vandals were damaging infrastructure." But even in the background, the storm was suddenly coming in. The system partially enacted as a law to protect any public land, and the conservation easement was approved with expedited processing, permanently protecting the spring as an agricultural and ecological resource. 3 downstream ranchers filed affidavits documenting improvements in creek flow since the restrictions were implemented. The reduced water flow to Sunrise Estates didn't cut off essential services. Homes still had water, but the lake level dropped steadily, and the main fountain was shut down to conserve water. HOA landscaping crews scrambled to adjust watering schedules as the reality of actual drought conditions finally reached their manicured lawns. The first cracks in Victoria's facade appeared when Sunrise Estates residents received an unexpected letter: an emergency assessment of $1,200, 0 cents per household for critical water infrastructure modifications. The letter vaguely referenced addressing supply chain disruptions, without mentioning the actual situation. Several residents contacted local news outlets, which began investigating the sudden assessment. The county paper ran a front-page story headlined, "Water Rights Dispute Threatens Sunrise Lake's Future," including satellite images showing the lake's rapidly receding shoreline. Victoria made a strategic error in her public response, telling reporters I was engaging in agricultural terrorism against progress and demanding county intervention. The inflammatory language backfired spectacularly. Children from Sunrise Estates began asking questions at school about why their lake was drying up during drought conditions. Several teachers used it as an educational opportunity about water conservation, with Emma's research becoming part of a science class project on local watersheds. The situation came to a head when several Sunrise families brought their children to our property line, asking if they could see the spring that fed their community. With Victoria out of town at a campaign event, I offered to give them a tour of the watershed. "This isn't about punishing anyone," I explained to the group, which included several children. "It's about using a scarce resource responsibly during drought conditions." When a young boy asked why his family's swimming pool had to stay empty while they had been running fountains, his mother looked visibly uncomfortable. "That's actually a really good question, Tyler," she said quietly. Word of this impromptu tour reached Victoria quickly. She called an emergency board meeting where she proposed legal action against homeowners who had conspired with agricultural interests against the community. This overreach alienated even her supporters on the board. County officials took notice as drought conditions worsened, triggering mandatory water conservation measures. Agricultural users were already under strict limitations, but for the first time, residential developments faced similar restrictions. Commissioner Ramirez publicly questioned why Sunrise Estates had been permitted to construct major water features during an ongoing drought emergency. Victoria's position grew more desperate when the state engineer's office responded to our formal complaint by initiating a review of all water permits issued for the development. Internal HOA emails obtained by Walter revealed board members questioning Victoria's handling of the situation and the mounting legal expenses. On a sweltering Tuesday afternoon, Victoria arrived unannounced at my ranch, accompanied by a silver-haired man in an expensive suit, Gerald Phelps himself, the founding partner of her law firm. They pulled into my driveway in her Mercedes, kicking up dust that hung in the still air. "This has gone far enough, Miller," Victoria declared as they approached my porch. "We're prepared to file injunctions, damages claims, criminal charges, whatever it takes." I gestured to the security cameras clearly visible on my barn. "You're currently trespassing on private property. I'm happy to discuss this matter through proper channels with attorneys present." Phelps placed a restraining hand on Victoria's arm as she stepped forward. "We're prepared to offer compensation for the pipeline easement, a fair market value." "The issue isn't just the pipeline," I replied. "It's the water theft, environmental damage, and fraudulent permitting. But again, I'm not discussing this without my attorney." "This development represents millions in investment," Victoria snapped. "You can't hold an entire community hostage over some ancient water claim." "I'm simply exercising my legally documented rights, the same rights your development has been violating. Your residents might want to ask why you didn't secure proper water access before building water features in a drought zone." Emma had been recording the conversation from inside. After they left, she played it back, smiling. "Dad, you sounded just like Mom in that hospital board meeting when they tried to move her to a different floor." That night, my motion-activated cameras captured two men attempting to access the spring property around 2 a.m. When the security lights flooded the area, they quickly retreated to a truck bearing the Sunrise Landscaping logo. The beam of flashlights bouncing through trees at night looked like fireflies with bad intentions. I immediately called Sheriff Morton, who responded personally. His deputies caught the men a mile down the road, employees of Victoria's company who claimed they were checking on equipment but had no work orders or authorization paperwork. The incident report filed that night changed the dynamic considerably. What had been a civil dispute now involved potential criminal trespassing and attempted tampering with a protected water source. The sheriff's department increased patrols past both properties, and local media picked up the story of the midnight intrusion. By week's end, Sunrise Estates was in turmoil. The lake had dropped to half its original level, with a ring of exposed mud around its perimeter. Children had taken to calling it Victoria's Mud Puddle, a name that spread through local schools with devastating efficiency. Residents were divided between those demanding the board resolve the water issue immediately and others insisting on fighting my extortion. Victoria's political support began eroding as questions about her conflict of interest with Sunrise Landscaping gained traction. As pressure mounted, she made her final tactical error. She petitioned the county commission to use eminent domain to seize control of Campbell Spring as a critical public utility, scheduling the hearing for their next public meeting. Her campaign supporters planned a large showing, positioning the issue as rural obstruction versus community progress. What she didn't realize was that her public hearing would become the perfect stage for the full truth to emerge. The county commission chamber was standing room only. Sunrise Estates residents filled half the seats, many wearing blue Protect Our Community shirts Victoria's campaign had distributed. Local ranchers and farmers occupied another section, while reporters from 3 local outlets set up cameras near the front. The drought emergency was the first agenda item, with the county water manager presenting alarming statistics about reservoir levels and conservation failures. When the Campbell Spring dispute came up, Commissioner Wilson attempted to limit public comments to 2 minutes each, but Commissioner Ramirez successfully motioned for extended discussion given the significant public interest. Victoria approached the podium first, immaculately dressed in a navy suit. her presentation slides showing idyllic images of Sunrise Lake alongside charts of property values and tax revenues. Commissioners, this dispute represents a fundamental choice about our community's future, she began. Sunrise Estates contributes over $3,200,000, 0 cents annually in property taxes and houses nearly 400 families in quality homes. We're being held hostage by one individual, exploiting an archaic technicality to extort our community. She described my actions as deliberately vindictive and threatening the investments of hundreds of residents. Her voice rose dramatically as she detailed the devastating impact on the community. We simply asked the Commission to exercise its authority to declare this water source a public utility under eminent domain, with fair compensation to all legitimate stakeholders. Progress cannot be held back by outdated agricultural priorities when our community's growth is at stake. HOA residents testified about concerns regarding their property values and amenities they'd been promised when purchasing homes. The HOA treasurer detailed the financial burden of finding alternative water sources, while their attorney emphasized the public good justification for government intervention. When my turn came, I approached the podium carrying a single accordion folder. No slides, no dramatic presentation, just documents and facts. But I wasn't alone. I had asked Emma to join me, standing tall beside her father. Commissioners, this situation began very simply, I started, my voice calm. Sunrise Estates HOA constructed a pipeline across my property without proper easements, then tapped a water source they don't own rights to. Everything else is just consequences of those actions. I methodically presented a visual timeline showing each step of the HOA's project, alongside the actual permitting requirements they'd bypassed. When Victoria attempted to interrupt, claiming I was misrepresenting technical details, I simply continued laying out documented facts. The room fell silent when Walter Simmons, the retired federal judge, approached the podium. His testimony about witnessing board discussions of deliberately bypassing proper procedures because penalties would be cheaper than compliance visibly shocked many residents. The county permit supervisor confirmed no environmental impact study had been filed despite being legally required for watershed modifications. The state water engineer testified that Sunrise Estates was diverting water at rates far beyond any historical right they could claim. Then came the financial revelations. Using public records, I demonstrated how Victoria's landscaping company had received $380,000, 0 cents, for the lake installation, plus a $16,500, 0 cents monthly maintenance contract. Commissioner Ramirez asked Victoria directly about this conflict of interest, which she dismissed as transparent and previously disclosed, though no such disclosure appeared in HOA minutes. The mood in the room shifted perceptibly when I presented permit applications containing obvious signature discrepancies, alongside an environmental impact report showing damage to protected riparian species habitat. Filing false information on water permits isn't just unethical, it's illegal in almost every state. Commissioner Ramirez emphasized this by asking the county attorney to approach the podium and confirm the potential legal implications. For my closing statement, I stepped aside and let Emma speak, something we'd practiced but kept secret. "I'm Emma Miller," she began, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "I'm 16, and this ranch has been my family's home for 3 generations. When my mom was dying, she made my dad promise to protect our land for my future." She held up her phone, showing photos of the dried creek beds and struggling wildlife. "This isn't about property values or fancy fountains. It's about respecting what sustains all of us. My classmates from Sunrise Estates can't swim in their pools right now because of water restrictions, but until recently their community had fountains running 24/7 during a drought." She looked directly at Victoria. "My mom taught me that leadership means taking responsibility. Real leaders don't falsify permits, ignore environmental laws, or bully teenagers on social media when they're caught breaking rules." The stunned silence that followed was broken by spontaneous applause from both sides of the room. I stepped forward again, revealing the conservation easement plan I'd established. "I'm not interested in depriving anyone of water they legally have rights to," I explained. I've prepared a legitimate easement agreement with fair compensation terms for the pipeline corridor and a sustainable water usage plan that ensures both agricultural operations and residential needs are met. I held up the original 1887 water rights document alongside photographs of the damaged wetlands and pastures. These rights weren't created to be weapons. They were established to ensure water, our most precious resource, is used responsibly and sustainably, especially during drought conditions. That's all I'm asking for. Responsible usage according to established law. The commissioners called a brief recess after our presentation. When they returned, the chamber had grown tense with whispered conversations among HOA residents. Victoria sat rigidly at the applicant's table, her attorney whispering urgently in her ear. Commissioner Ramirez moved to deny the eminent domain request, citing substantial questions of procedural propriety and clear evidence of pre-existing water rights. The motion passed unanimously, with even Victoria's ally, Commissioner Wilson, voting in favor after adding a recommendation for good faith negotiations between all parties. As Victoria gathered her materials, several HOA residents approached her with angry questions about the assessments and conflict of interest revelations. She attempted to exit quickly, but cameras caught her being confronted in the parking lot by a group of homeowners, demanding explanations about the emergency fees and misrepresentations. Sheriff Morton approached the commissioner's table, speaking quietly with the county attorney while reviewing some of the documentation I'd presented. The sound of the gavel striking as the meeting adjourned was like a final nail in the coffin of Victoria's ambitions, both for control of the water source and for her political future. The fallout came swiftly. Within a week, Victoria resigned from the HOA board, citing personal reasons, though everyone knew the real story. The county prosecutor opened an ethics investigation into the permit approval process, with 2 county employees placed on administrative leave pending review. Sunrise Landscaping's contracts were immediately canceled by the interim HOA board. My damage claims were settled for the full $34,876.00 plus $18,000.00 in legal fees. The new HOA leadership, headed by Walter Simmons, negotiated a fair water usage agreement that included proper easements, permits, and reasonable compensation for the pipeline corridor. Most importantly, the agreement contained strict conservation requirements and seasonal usage limitations. Water is like money in the bank, I explained at the community meeting where we signed the agreement. We all need to make deposits before we can make withdrawals. The settlement included environmental remediation funding to restore the wetland areas damaged during construction. 4 months after the hearing, native grasses were already reclaiming the once muddy construction scars across my pasture. Emma experienced her own victory when the school administration finally addressed the online bullying she'd endured. The ringleaders faced consequences, but more importantly, her powerful speech at the commission meeting had transformed her status from victim to hero among her peers. Students from both farming and suburban families sought her help with environmental science projects. One Sunday morning, I found her sitting on the porch swing, reading her mother's journal. "Mom would have loved how this turned out," she said, looking up with a smile that reminded me so much of Sarah. Not just winning, but bringing people together afterward. While the pipeline remained, it now operated under a shared drought management plan that protected agricultural water needs during critical growing periods. When properly managed, water can meet everyone's needs. It's just about priorities and respecting the resource. The resolution brought unexpected healing to our community. Ranchers and residents began finding common ground on water conservation strategies. The new HOA leadership initiated regular meetings with surrounding agricultural properties to address shared concerns before they became conflicts. The most visible symbol of change was the transformation of Sunrise Lake. Instead of a water-intensive ornamental feature, it became a demonstration project for drought-resistant landscaping and sustainable water management. Children who had once mocked Emma now attended her weekend workshops on native plant identification. As for me, the victory wasn't about beating Victoria or the HOA. It was about fulfilling the promise I'd made to Sarah before she passed, that I'd protect our family legacy for Emma. Sitting on the porch swing one evening, watching the creek flow strong again through the south pasture, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced since losing Sarah. The settlement funds allowed me to establish the historic Water Rights Education Center at the Spring property, hosting school field trips and community workshops on sustainable water management. The annual Watershed Festival now brings together residents from both agricultural and suburban communities to celebrate our shared heritage and interdependence. When I found an old photograph of Sarah standing by Campbell Spring taken on our third date long before Emma was born, I had it enlarged and framed for the center's entrance hall. Beneath it, a simple plaque reads, "Water connects us all. Use it wisely." It's become something of a local motto. I created a scholarship fund for local students pursuing agricultural or environmental studies, named in Sarah's memory. The conservation easement expanded to create a protected wildlife corridor connecting several properties along the creek, preserving natural habitat while maintaining working ranches. When Commissioner Ramirez nominated me to serve on the County Water Board, I accepted, finding myself in meetings with some of the same officials I'd once battled. State legislators even began considering reforms to water rights enforcement based on the precedents established in our case. Perhaps most surprisingly, several Sunrise Estates residents became allies in promoting sustainable water practices. Their community gardens now feature drought-resistant native plants, and their redesigned water features operate on a fraction of the previous consumption. Emma's latest project involves local elementary students creating water guardian pledges that hang in businesses throughout the county. "It's not about blame," she explained to a reporter. "It's about everyone taking responsibility for what we share." The sound of spring water flowing freely again provides a musical reminder that some things can't be bought or bullied, only respected. Water, like justice, finds its own level eventually if you just clear the path. So that's my story, folks. Drop your HOA nightmare stories in the comments. I read every single one. And hit subscribe for next week's story about the mall developer who tried to condemn 22 family farms and how one forgotten railroad deed stopped them cold. Remember, it's not about getting even. It's about standing your ground when the ground literally belongs to you. Water rights, property lines, or just basic respect. Sometimes the best revenge is simply enforcing what's already written in black and white.